as well as something that is more you can invest back on the next products. So fundamentals, like I said, business model. One example is an MRI machine. So a big company could be selling a MRI machine for a huge cost to a hospital, but if you keep adding their consumables again and again, so for each patient they might have a difficulty in purchasing. So these are the pain points that hospitals might have. Some of the resistance, some of the things they will look for alternatives. So if they are coming up with some novel idea saying that this can be sterilized and reused, so that is something could be a better business model. And so if any business model, it should look like something what you're offering is basically based on your strengths and capabilities, and it should also be something the customer should have a desirable interaction. So an appropriate business model must allow the company to extract value out of it, but at the same time it makes sense for the customer. So the example is similar to this. So the
feedback last year we had Dr.
Dr. Jagdish Chaturvedi.
So he I think a few days back he wrote, and I pretty much agree. He said that initially when I started my journey, I was thinking I will be making stuff, innovating. But after I have made few products, now he told that maybe I will be spending 80% of my effort making things and 20% sales. But now he feels now the thing has reversed.
Yes.
80% of his effort now goes into sales and marketing.
Yes.
And 20% to just maintaining or building.
Yeah. 20% after a certain point, it feels that there is 80% of work that has to go through for the post marketing, sales, and everything. So these are some of the things that you should be looking at, factors like how are you going to generate the revenue, and what is the price point, what is the margin. Say if you're making it at 30,000, what is the margin that you're selling at, and what is the investment, sales investment. For example, you are having a sales representative for selling it in certain local areas in city. So how much you are paying them, and how are you going to recover that money? So all these things comes under, you will have to take into consideration. And if you are making an instrument and it requires a certain kind of a training to the customer or to the patient caretakers or to paramedics or to the doctors, so who is going to do the training, and what is the differentiator, competitive differentiator, and all these things would come into place when you are looking at specific business model criteria. So these are like some of these business model for existing disposables, reusables, implants, capital, service, per use, and over the counter. So over the counters are like you don't need a prescription, and prescription, physician. So these are like the margin structures. These are like sales investments and IP barriers, some of these clinical hurdles based on the particular device. So before you jump into one business model, you need to basically cross-verify, what if I can do it other way? What if this device sold to 100 hospitals through just unit price? What if I could give them on a service-based per patient, those kind of way. So you need to estimate all these things and come up with, okay, this is the better way to do. So or this better way only applies for certain markets, or this way only applies for this model. For example, government hospitals might not be willing to pay for the entire device, which is expensive on a one-time cost. For example, there is a device called a company called Soham Innovation. So they made a ear screening for newborns. So they sell it for private hospitals. They might sell it for at 3 lakh rupee cost, but for the NGOs, for the low income communities, hospitals, they might not afford to buy it. So they could charge per patient. You could utilize it, or a rental basis. So you want to validate what specific market that you're targeting, what business model exactly makes sense for certain kind of areas. Apollo might buy your equipment, but small hospitals might not be able to buy the equipment. So at that time, you will have to make a trade-off.
Profitability has always to be kept in mind. It's not that nobody when they start the startup, your primary objective is to make money. Your primary that should always be in mind. It cannot be that you are not making money and
Yes.
you can run, because company will close down in
Yeah.
if you don't make money. So even if you are doing for a smaller hospital, if you change the model for a service model, like
Yeah.
you are per patient basis you are taking, you are thinking like, okay, Apollo has lesser number of patients, high paying patients, but smaller hospitals have larger number of patients of low paying patients.
Yeah.
So maybe the model can be worked out,
Yeah.
so that we still are profitable there. We cannot make loss there.
Yeah, so very important that you recover the payment back. That is very important. So many times you give, so you'll have to have a proper agreements with the hospital in order to get the things. So these are some of the decision tree or rule of thumb for choosing a business model. So revenue stream could be per patient or per acquisition or per term. Term is basically like a service based, like per patient is like how you are looking at all these disposables, or acquisition is basically the capital equipments. And pricing, and how much unit pricing are you having for one specific device, and if you are selling 10 of this and to one specific hospital, how much you want to make a revenue over a period of time. So all these things you will have to do some projections, and you will have to see calculations. Say if you are selling to 500,000 patients over a period of time, you will have to calculate it with your particular devices, and all these statistics, like if there are like 100 hospitals that you are going to cover. So how you are going to price it for all these things, and multiply that with the device unit. So gross margin is basically, like I said, you are basically the cost to make a device is say 20,000, and you are selling it at 60,000. So the difference is the gross margin. So that is the gross margin. That is what will give you profits. But many times you invest on sales, you invest on the hospital doctors for all the clinical trials, or you invest on the travel, you invest on the regulatory. So that cost will actually go to the existing spent money on investment. So when we talk about prototyping, so you're meeting a doctor during an observation, and you're saying that doctor, you're getting all this information, and you're talking about some specific problem, and the doctor tells you that, can you make this affordable, can you make it faster, can you make it easy to use. So you cannot directly make a final product. So you start with early stage prototyping. So it could be a small prototype with just duct tapes and all that. So, but that will give you a sense of how the product would look like over a period of time, how you want to add the specific technical specifications that you would add on top of it, and how you would get the initial preliminary data feedback from target users.
So even if it's a hard device, it's very essential. You may be thinking for a lot, but just making a thing, even if it's by jugaad, यहाँ से थोड़ा 3D print करके थोड़ा सा कुछ एक tape लगा के,
Yeah.
Once you make the thing, it has a real look and feel. Then you have a pathway which is clear. You know that now I can find out how to really manufacture it.
For example,
that happens. You may be thinking, nothing comes on the board.
Yeah. For example, there is a real need for storing vaccines at specific temperature, and you might not come up with the final product. You could be basically using some thermocol, and you could come up with some cooling mechanism with small low cost piezoelectric, which would have one side heating and Peltier. Yeah. So you could come up with small prototypes which would see whether it is viable. And all these things, when you test it out, during iteration process, you will see what is the challenges, like in terms of performance, in terms of the successes and all these gaps. Because when you prototype, you will know the challenge, what is working, what is not working, and what are the technical things that you would have to focus on to get the product right. So if you look at the prototyping spectrum from the initial early stage, it is going to be a long journey till final product comes, because you are basically at each iteration you are solving some problem, you are fixing some issue, and you are coming back and you're testing it out on a, in a simulated environment. So the final prototype will require a lot of investment. So initial prototype might not require a lot of investment because you're testing it with low cost equipment. But after you you validate your initial idea and you pitch it at some competitions, awards or grants, then you see that your product is getting some feedback from certain industry experts or some authorities saying that this is something is our focus and what you're doing is great and we want to fund you, we want to award you. So that's when you know that, okay, this idea has some potential. Then you start getting money for this and you invest on that and you develop and you apply for grants and you make something, a tangible product over a period of time. So yeah, some of the questions, like you'll have to keep iterating. What is the functionality? What is the what are the different stages? So prototyping has a lot of milestones you'll be going through. Milestone can be your initial prototype, and then you could be developing a early stage proof of concept, which you would be testing it out. The advantages and disadvantages of early stage working models. So we'll talk about advantages. Advantages can be it is easy to be done, flexible. It can give you a sense of what needs to be done. The advantages or disadvantages could be it might not give the necessary information for you for the long term, but it is not completely clear what to do. So but keeping this in mind, so you'll have to keep validating your initial prototypes and take it further. So the stages of prototype. It will have non-clinical and preclinical and clinical. So non-clinical is where the most of the prototyping work goes, where you would do crude prototyping and do some bench tops testing. You would do some simulated testing with mannequins, and then you start taking it to a next level where you would be going for preclinical testing and then clinical studies and testing and clinical trials. So this kind of a stage is what you will go through in prototyping. For example, there is a device, say it is being used to treat for surgical equipments or patients who have some kind of a certain condition. So you are making a tool for doctors to use it. So initially you are making a tool which is not something biocompatible, which is something which can be tested out, and then you validate it with some doctors. You could come up with some actual biocompatible, which is completely acceptable for preclinical testing and go for clinical studies.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Go to the in the preclinical section.
Yeah.
There is chronic animal testing.
Yes.
What is that?
So this is something for specific devices. If it is a therapeutic device, so it is important that you, according to FDA or some CDSE also will ask for animal testing. So they before it could be a lungs, or it could be a mouse. So there are some labs which does animal testing. They wanted before it actually tested on a patient, like a human, they wanted to see it on animal. So this might not applicable most of the times, but for some therapeutic devices or some therapeutic solutions, animal testing might require. So you need to focus on your strengths and you need to know your weaknesses. So pros and cons of in-house and outsourced prototyping. So you could be outsourcing certain product design because that would be your final product which is going to market, but your strengths could be in terms of the whole development of initial prototype, doing the R&D work. So we're talking about outsourcing strategy. So what you could outsource, what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages? For example, some company might be doing it for low cost, some outsourcing work, 3D printing, or they could be good at some essentially doing all the molds for your product, vacuum casting, all these things. So some of the things that you could outsource, some of the things you cannot outsource. So you should have a clear differentiator between what you can outsource, what you cannot outsource, and these are things you would get to know once you have a product and once you started taking it to testing at early stage clinical studies. So final concept selection would involve all choosing your product development in terms of IP, business model. So when you're going for final concept selection, you should look at the weightage, what is your criteria that you're looking at, and what particular specifications that you want to focus on, what specific criteria or requirements, and based on that you could allot certain weightage, and you could say that, okay, this is what I want to take it as a final concept, and prototype, take it to the next level. And so we're talking about R&D. So R&D is basically, say you apply for some Department of Science and Technology grant program. So you would have to walk through give a vision for the grant authorities that what you're gonna do for the next 2 years or next 5 years, or how you're gonna do the R&D process over a period of time. It involves key milestones, like for the first 6 months we would be designing and developing certain prototype, and then next 6 months we would be basically testing the prototype and seeing how the results are coming, and using that results we would be checking how to overcome the existing issues, challenges, and those milestones you will have to define them. You'll have to define them, and you'll have to prioritize how your strategy for R&D would be. And after that, you validate these solutions for those. So you would come up with a proof of concept, and before you're going into a final prototype or product, and which is basically viable. And some of the practical near-term perspective for R&D is basically how original the need is ultimately addressed, and it will give an idea of what are the frameworks. For example, we are developing a device, and to make the device I need a lot of testing, experimental setup, I need a lot of the material of construction. So all these things you will have to define. It will not only be useful for yourself, but it will also be useful when you are going for all these applying for funding opportunities, or getting some systems in place in your company when you are starting to for more people to work on the same idea. So these are some of the milestones for R&D. So you would be initially developing proof of concept for the feasibility, and then you would go for initial working prototype, and then you would go for checking the performance, and then you would go for effectiveness, and then you would go for long-term studies in animals, and then you would go for clinical trials, pre-production, production. So once you have a prototype, once you have a product which is good enough to be tested on a patient, you always want to make sure that whether you get proper feedback from all the stakeholders, whether you got all the proper feedback from the doctors, you should be able to get ethics committee approval in hospitals before you go for a clinical studies. So if you are working on some diagnostic or some screening which is monitoring distress conditions for a baby due to hypothermia or some other sleep apnea, something like that, so you cannot directly go out and test it on some patient. You'll have to get ethics committee approval, you'll have to get a regulatory approval before it is going for a clinical study. So that is where the regulatory approval comes into place. In India we have CDSCO. CDSCO has to give you, if you're doing an investigation study, you will have to get approval from CDSCO, which would basically allow you to do clinical studies, and that results are basically used for you to get your manufacturing license and go for marketing and sales. So when you talk about clinical trials, so there are different ways how you are doing clinical trials. Like it would just be a prospective or a randomized or a controlled trials. So prospective is basically you are just taking whatever the inclusion criteria. If say we are doing a monitoring for a child, when there is a hypothermia condition, we just want to give an alert. So it's a variable. So you are looking at children from newborns to some specific age criteria, and not very sick patients. All these could come under inclusion criteria, and you are just taking as the inclusion criteria comes in, you are looking at prospective. But if you are doing a randomized, that is when you are comparing existing your device with some other device, and you're saying that my device is performing better than that device, or it is equivalent to that device, which is like a predicate. So you could go for a randomized control trial where you are doing a RCT. So some of these things would apply. And clinical trial costs you'll have to look into, because it takes a lot of money. You'll have to pay for the doctor, you'll have to pay for the research staff, you'll have to pay for patient, and this would be very expensive process when that's where you'll have to secure funding before you go for clinical trials. And sponsors could be government or any big companies who are willing to fund the research. So clinical studies, if you're doing clinical studies in a hospital like AIIMS, so you'll have to speak with the doctor in AIIMS to get the approval. The doctor has to be your principal investigator. So you are basically the sponsor for that study, and you are basically telling that this is a novel product, or this is a product which does so and so XYZ. So are you interested to do a clinical study? So the doctor might have a publication. You would have a product validated for you to take it to the market, and probably the hospital might adopt your product if they find that the product is good enough for using it. Yeah. So it would involve a lot of things like endpoints. So endpoints are basically, if your device is used on a patient, what are the outcomes? What are the outcomes that you're looking at? Is it the the severity you're looking at, or is it the patient's the way the patient is responding, or it's a SpO2, or is it a respiratory rate? So all these things would be outcomes. So for example, there is a parameter called you're looking at one of the major reasons for mortality in children is hypoxemia. So hypoxemia, so you're looking at pulse oximeter, and you're saying that our claim is if the patient is having certain condition, and that condition we are using this device, and if this device is basically recovering the patient from that hypoxemic condition, so that could be endpoint. So endpoint, you can define all these endpoints, and it has to be very clear, because that is what is going to define the success of your statistically. So what is the sample size? So sample size is basically you'll have to hire a biostatistician to determine how many patients you're going to try. Is it going to be a pilot study? If it's going to be a pilot study, so initially the sample size could be between 30 to some few hundreds, and you'll have to calculate that sample size. And whoever the patient comes in, the inclusion criteria, that patients are being tested by the doctors. So all the institution ethics committee approval will be approved only after the protocol, the study design of your clinical trial is being, once it is verified by the doctor, and then once they approve it, the patient enrollment happens, inclusion criteria is being done. So many times what happens is inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, it is very important because a patient might have certain condition, and the doctor might think that, oh yes, this patient is having a certain condition which matches to the inclusion criteria, but there is a different scenarios where many times what happens is the doctors might not recognize the exclusion criteria, which is basically saying that there could be a conflict between inclusion and exclusion. For example, if the patient might have pneumonia, but the patient could also have sepsis. Sepsis could be an exclusion criteria. So that is something that you'll have to clearly define. Yeah.
So here, as we are also studying biostatistics, so the statistical power and trial size, these two are important concepts. You will understand this if you, for example, yesterday I talked about the Gaussian standard deviation, the thickness of the Gaussian, that reduces when you increase the sample size, because as square root of n divided by square root of n hota hai. So that means your statistical power, if you increase the trial size, what happens is if there is a, suppose एक device लगाने के बाद एक बहुत छोटा सा difference आ रहा है, तो Gaussian अगर बहुत thin है, तो बहुत थोड़ा सा difference भी हमें पूरा tail में आएगा, right? पर उस Gaussian को thin करने के लिए क्या करना पड़ेगा? Trial size बढ़ाना पड़ेगा. So if your effect is very small, then your trial size has to be very large. If your effect is large, then trial size you can manage with small trials also, and that's what determines your statistical power.
Yeah, for example, there is a device. There is a device which there is a device which works on pneumonia. Pneumonia, it's for ventilator-induced pneumonia. So most of the times, patients who are admitted to ICUs, they get infections within hospital because the bacteria in the ventilators are not properly sterilized or not due to the environment. So it gets secreted in the lungs. So one device, they have made some, it is basically like it removes the secretion from all this airway. So that device, they cannot go and test it for some few hundred patients. They can initially only test it for few number of patients because it is a high risk device, and it has to be tested on a small, because the higher the risk is, you want to test it immediately. Then you go for larger sample size for pivotal studies. So when you are having a principal investigator, the doctor could be a principal investigator. So you should also look at who is going to take the data, the readings over a period of time. So it could be a staff nurse, research nurse, and all these things you will have to maintain. And good clinical practice is something that regulatory bodies like CDSCO would ask for. Whether your company, does it have ISO 13485? Are you having a CRO, clinical research organization? So you should hire some consultant who is expert on taking care of all these things in terms of a good clinical practice and the trial management. So these are some of the exemptions for using an investigation, exemptions outside of using an investigation device exemptions. So those are like emergency use, compassionate use, treatment use. These are some of the things. So yeah, so when you're going for development and planning, these are the strategies that you should look at, like what is your sales and distribution strategy, what is the competitive strategy, and what is the regulatory strategy. So one is, so I want to talk about innovations in maternal child health. So you could look at infant warmers. There are devices which are coming in for hypothermia to keep the baby, and there is for jaundice, there is a phototherapy, and there for patients who are getting monitoring device for pregnant women, a fetal cardiac monitor which could do the monitoring for uterine contraction and for fetal heart rate and also fetal movement, and CPAP units which basically provides oxygen, cardiovascular ultrasounds. So some of these equipments that are available for innovations which available for maternal child health, but we need much more cost effective, we need much more portable, we need much more efficient, so easy to use, those kind of things which there is always a need for maternal child health. So usability studies is basically when you want to simulate certain kind of hypothesis. So you have a hypothesis that whether my device can do this, or if I am giving this device to a hospital, how are the nurses going to handle, how are the doctors going to handle. So you are basically going to see what is the error, use error and usage errors. So those errors are basically whether that error can lead to any death or injury, that you will have to test it before it is actually tested on a patient. So it could be a mannequin, it could be in a simulated environment, some simulators which could test all these things, and you are basically iterating all these possibilities, what can go wrong if your device is used in a clinical scenarios. So yeah, for a patient monitor, it could be a simulated patient sensor leading to a monitor, and you are basically seeing how the printing of electrocardiogram is working. Or an endoscope, you are basically simulating it into a digestive tract, which is not actually a patient, but you are doing it in a simulated environment. Nowadays, VR and AR is very useful in this scenario, where VR can be used for training, surgical, VR and AR can be used for surgical. So you could develop some application which basically allows doctors to train in a surgical environment or for a treatment. Dialysis, they are doing something which is basically for AR based. So yeah, insulin pump. So you're basically looking at how the device is working in a simulated environment. So if you are starting a startup, or for biotech startup, for medical device startup, You should look at what are the market risks, what are the technical risks, how are you going to make money, and how are you going to launch a product, whether it is going to be whether you're going to bootstrap it, or you're going to make a go through an investment strategy. So
People here are not aware about bootstrap.
okay, bootstrap is basically if you are not taking outside money, investment, you're basically investing your own money, and you are making a
Or your family's money or your
organic way, yeah. So bootstrapping is basically that.
And many times people will not give you money unless you have a
Working prototype, sometime revenue.
You have to bootstrap.
Yeah. So that's why these grants and all these things will come into play. And one example is, so bootstrapping is for a long term. You want to solve you want to develop some technology